The most shocking Viking deaths that were real begin not with a forgotten chieftain or nameless raider, but with Ragnar Lodbrok himself, the terror of Francia, scourge of England, and one of the most feared men of his age. When King Ælla of Northumbria at last caught him, Ragnar was not granted the swift blow of a sword or the dignity of battle. Instead, he was lowered into a pit alive, a pit that moved and hissed, the ground itself writhing with serpents. The cage creaked, the ropes strained, and the Viking king dropped into the shifting sea of scales. Adders coiled around his limbs, their fangs sinking into his flesh, venom pumping into his blood. The hall echoed not with Ragnar's screams, but with his laughter. Ælla, expecting to break the will of the great raider, instead watched as Ragnar began to chant. It was not a plea for mercy, nor a curse upon his captor, but a song of death words that carried across the pit like steel striking stone. He sang of battles fought, of spears shattered, of kings defied. He sang of Odin's hall, where the brave feast eternal. He sang of his sons, the little pigs, who would grunt in fury when they learned of the old boar's fate. The snakes worked their poison into his body, but Ragnar's voice did not falter. His laughter rose above the hissing pit, echoing louder than Elar's victory. This was no ordinary death. Ælla had chosen the pit to deny Ragnar glory, to humiliate him, to show the Vikings that even their greatest could be broken. Yet the attempt turned against him. By laughing at agony, by transforming his execution into performance, Ragnar achieved a triumph greater than any battle won. His death became a prophecy. His song crossed the sea faster than ships could sail, carried in whispers and shouts to the ears of his sons Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubi. The venom silenced his body, but it awakened something far worse than Ragnar himself, the great heathen army. What followed was not a raid, but a storm. When those sons landed in England, they did not come for plunder. They came for blood, for vengeance, for a reckoning that would scar kingdoms. Ælla's snake pit, meant to extinguish a Viking flame, instead kindled an inferno that devoured Northumbria and sent shockwaves across Christendom. This is why Ragnar's death stands among the most shocking Viking deaths that were real. It was not the pit of serpents that gave it power, but the defiance of a man who chose to die laughing. For the Vikings, death was not an end. It was a stage, a weapon, a legend. Ragnar Lodbrok proved it with his final breath, turning poison into prophecy and humiliation into immortality. The tale of the blood eagle has echoed across centuries, a vision so cruel it is hard to tell whether it was born of fact or the dark imagination of saga poets. After Ragnar Lodbrok met his fate in the snake pit, his sons returned to England not as raiders but as avengers. When King Ælla of Northumbria fell into their hands, the sagas claim he was given no simple death by sword or noose. Instead, they carved upon him the most dreaded punishment of all the blood eagle. His back was split open, ribs broken away from the spine, lungs pulled out and spread wide like wings. Salt was sprinkled into the wounds, the sagas say, a final cruelty as Ælla writhed, his life leaving him in agony. To the Norse mind, this was not merely execution. It was theatre, vengeance shaped into horror, a message carved into flesh that none could mistake. But was the blood eagle real? Scholars have argued over it for generations. Some say it was no more than a poetic metaphor, the wings of an eagle symbolizing the soul's flight from the body, twisted in retelling into an act of torture. Others point to skeletal remains with marks that suggest rib bones split and torn, evidence that such a thing might have been attempted. Yet in truth, it may not matter whether every detail of the ritual was carried out in flesh. What mattered was that people believed it. Belief gave it power. The whisper of the blood eagle was enough to freeze the hearts of enemies before the axe was ever raised. Imagine the effect it must have had upon those who heard it, told the great king who cast Ragnar to the snakes, now stretched out beneath the knives of his sons, his body turned into a symbol of vengeance. Whether he lived long enough to feel each cut or not, whether the wings ever spread as the sagas claim, the story alone was enough to terrify. For Vikings, death was not only the end of life, but a stage for defiance and memory. By telling the world that Ælla had been given to the blood eagle, Ragnar's sons made their vengeance eternal. In that act, real or imagined, lies the essence of Viking death culture. The truth of the blade was less important than the story carved into the minds of those who heard it. Ælla's screams may have faded into the earth, but the terror of his supposed fate lived on, shaping how the world saw the Norse for centuries to come. The blood eagle remains one of the most shocking Viking deaths, not because we know it was real, but because it may never matter if it was. The fear it inspired was the truest weapon of all. The year was 845, and the Seine ran thick with fear. Ragnar Lodbrok had led his fleet of longships upriver, their dragon prows cutting the mist as they descended upon Paris. The Frankish capital, proud and holy, was taken by storm. Monasteries were stripped bare, churches set aflame, the treasures of saints carried away in rough Viking hands. When at last Emperor Charles the Bald gathered tribute to buy their retreat, he sought also to make an example. Several of the captured Norsemen were condemned to die by hanging, their bodies strung up before the walls, so that all might see what fate awaited those who defied the grandson of Charlemagne. The gallows were raised, and the crowd gathered in expectation of repentance. These heathens, they thought, would tremble before death. Surely they would curse their fate, beg for mercy, call upon strange gods that could not save them. Yet what the Franks witnessed that day seared itself into their chronicles in disbelief. The Vikings did not beg. They laughed. Bound and led to the noose, they exchanged jokes, speaking of Valhalla as if the gallows were but a doorway. One asked to be hanged higher than his companions, so that he might see farther into the hall of the slain. Another requested that a piece of his innards be nailed to the post, a charm, he said, that would bring fortune to travellers. And as the ropes tightened around their necks, the condemned men mocked their executioners, greeting death not with terror, but with mirth. The Frankish chronicler who recorded the scene struggled to comprehend it. How could men face such an end with smiles on their lips? To Christian eyes, death was judgment, the soul weighed and measured, and execution a sign of shame. But to these men from the north, it was something different. They had been raised on sagas where a warrior's last words mattered more than his deeds, where to laugh in the face of doom was to triumph even as life fled. To them, death by rope was no dishonour if it was met with defiance. Fear was the only true defeat. In that moment, Charles's warning to the north turned hollow. For though those Vikings dangled lifeless before the walls of Paris, their laughter rang louder than the creak of the gallows. Their enemies expected terror and found instead a spectacle of courage. And in their refusal to yield, they carved a new legend into the minds of their foes, that a Viking could not be broken even when his body hung limp in the wind. This was the power of the Viking way of death, not merely to fight fiercely, but to die fiercely. The gallows in Paris had been meant to humble them. Instead, they left behind one of the most shocking Viking deaths that were real, a performance of fearlessness that turned execution into victory. The Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 was drenched in blood and omen, a clash that pitted King Olaf Haraldsson and his followers against a tide of Norwegian farmers and nobles who sought to cast him down. Among Olaf's men was Thormod Kolbrunarskald, a warrior and poet whose verses had long been sung in courts and camps alike. He fought as the day turned grim, blades flashing, shields splintering, the cries of the wounded rising like a dirge. And it was there, amidst the chaos, that fate found him. An arrow, loosed from the enemy's line, struck deep into his chest, close by the heart. Yet Thormod did not fall. He snapped the shaft, gritting his teeth, and with his own hands drew the arrowhead through his flesh, examining the torn pieces of tissue that clung to its barbs. Where another might have groaned, he spoke instead with bitter jest. "The king has fed us well," he said. "I am fat even around the heart." To the men beside him, it was more than bravado. It was defiance, a reminder that even in the shadow of death, the Viking spirit could mock its own suffering. Wounded, Thormod stumbled from the field to a nearby farmhouse where the injured were carried. The women tending the dying offered him porridge with leeks, a healer's trick to test whether the wound pierced his innards. If the stench of leeks drifted from the gash, his fate was sealed. Thormod pushed the bowl aside. "I have no need of porridge," he told them, refusing the test, refusing the thought of fear. What he asked for instead was a harp, and though blood trickled from his side, he lifted his voice in song. His final verses rose above the moans of the wounded, a skald's gift to the dying and the dead. He sang of battle, of loyalty to his king, of the courage that outlives flesh. His voice, though ragged, carried the weight of defiance, a song not of despair but of triumph. When at last his strength gave way, Thormod fell with music still upon his lips, his death transformed into poetry, his wound into legend. This was the Viking way of dying, not silence, not surrender, but the turning of agony into art. To the chroniclers, Thormod's last jest, his laughter at the arrow in his heart, stood as proof of the Norseman's mastery over fear. To his comrades, it was a memory sharper than any blade, a reminder that death itself could be sung into submission. And so Thormod Kolbrunarskald passed from the battlefield into saga. His arrow wound remembered not for its cruelty, but for the laughter and song it could not silence. Grettir Asmundarson, known in every corner of Iceland as Grettir the Strong, had lived his life like a storm untamed, fierce and forever hunted. Outlawed for killings both just and unjust, he spent nearly 20 years as a marked man, roaming the wild places where few dared follow. No chain could hold him, no ambush break him, no curse silence his strength. Yet even the mightiest storm meets its end, and for Grettir it came upon the bleak rock of Drangi Island, where he and his brother sought refuge from the world that pursued them. Sickness struck him there, a wasting weakness that gnawed at the giant until his limbs felt heavy as iron. His enemies, led by Thorir of Garth, learned of his failing health, and came at last to finish the task that swords alone had never managed. The island was besieged, and Grettir, though weakened, would not yield. They broke into his shelter, weapons drawn, expecting to find a dying man easily put down. Instead, they faced a lion still unbowed. Rising with effort, Grettir gripped his sword, the great blade that had felled so many foes, and made his stand. Blow after blow he struck, his body failing, yet his spirit blazing. The fight raged, but sickness and numbers overcame him. They cut him down, and Grettir, covered in blood, sank to the ground. Yet even in death he defied them. His hand clenched the hilt of his sword with such strength that no man could pry it free. The weapon remained bound to him, as if his very will had fused with the iron. His enemies, frustrated and fearful, tried to pull it loose, but the grip of Grettir was unbreakable. In the end, they were forced to hack off his hand to claim the sword. Only then did they know he was truly gone. Yet even in that act, Grettir robbed them of triumph. The image of the outlaw, hand severed yet still clutching his weapon, burned itself into the memory of Iceland. This was not the quiet death of a sick man. It was a performance in defiance, the ultimate gesture of a warrior who refused to release his strength even when life itself left him. To the sagas, his final grip was proof of the iron in his soul, the stubborn will that no outlawry, no curse, and no host of enemies could ever break. Grettir the Strong had lived as a hunted man, but he died as legend, his sword still in hand. His enemies forced to cut his body apart to claim victory. In that moment, he achieved what all Vikings sought, a death that would outlive him, a tale that would be told long after his bones were dust. Grettir's last act was not surrender but defiance, and it ensured that his name would echo forever in the sagas of the north. The windswept farmstead of Hlíðarendi became the stage for one of the most haunting deaths in all the sagas. Gunnar Hamundarson, famed across Iceland for his skill with bow and blade, had lived by courage and strength, yet now found his enemies at his door. Vengeance had gathered against him men he had bested, families he had shamed, rivals who could not forgive his greatness. They came in force, armed and ready, to bring him down in his own hall. Gunnar, alone save for his household, stood to meet them. From within the walls of his home, arrows rained as he fought them back, his bow bending, his aim unerring. Time and again his enemies fell, but fate is a cruel handmaiden, and at last his bowstring snapped. Surrounded and pressed, Gunnar called for what he needed most, a lock of his wife, Holgerða's long hair, to twist into a new string. It was a simple thing, and with it he might yet have fought them off, buying more moments of defiance. But Holgerða, remembering the sting of a slap from days long past, refused him. Her words fell colder than steel. Now you shall remember my blow. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy in the hall, the weight of betrayal greater than the swords that sought him. Gunnar, without bitterness in his tone but with the sharpness of truth, answered, "Then each must live with what they have." Denied his last hope, he cast aside the broken bow and drew his blade. If death had come for him, then he would meet it on his feet, face to face with the men who dared challenge him. The door splintered, and the attackers poured in. Gunnar fought like the wolf cornered in its den, each stroke of his sword ringing with fury, each step drenched in blood. Alone, he cut down many, his hall echoing with the clash of steel and the shouts of dying men. But numbers wore him down, and wounds slowed his hand. At last, his strength failed beneath the weight of spears and axes. Yet it was not the killing blow that made his death remembered, but the moment before it, the refusal of his wife, the calmness of his reply, the resolve to stand weapon in hand, though the odds were hopeless. Gunnar's end was not silence but defiance, the saga of a man who faced his doom without fear, without begging, without surrender. The men who killed him may have taken his life, but they could not take the manner of his dying. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi's last stand became a tale sung for generations, a warning, a lesson, a legend. For in his refusal to yield, even when betrayed, in his own hall, he claimed the only victory that mattered, to die unbroken, remembered as a warrior who met death as he had lived, with courage and fire. Egil Skallagrimsson, the black wolf of the sagas, had lived a life steeped in blood and poetry. A warrior without equal, a poet whose verses cut as deep as his sword, he had faced kings and enemies alike with the same iron defiance. But age, that slow and merciless foe, crept upon him at last. His sight dimmed until darkness swallowed him whole, and his once mighty body grew frail. Yet if his eyes could no longer see, his will remained unbroken. He would not surrender his end to weakness, nor allow his enemies the triumph of watching him wither. In his final days, when the hall had grown quiet, and whispers of death circled like ravens, Egil took to a task that only he knew. He gathered silver and gold, the wealth he had taken from raids and gifts, treasures of a lifetime stained with war. With his failing strength, he hauled it to a secret place, hiding it deep where no greedy hand could ever claim it. None watched him, none followed. To this day, the hoard of Egil is said to lie buried, unseen, its resting place swallowed by time, guarded by the memory of a man too proud to leave it behind. When this last work was done, Egil turned from treasure to death itself. Refusing the warmth of hearth or the pity of kin, he crawled away into solitude, dragging his weary body toward the end he had chosen. Not for him the sickbed or the priest, not for him the lingering death of the weak. He sought a death that was his own, as fierce as the life he had lived. Somewhere beyond the farm, in the cold silence, he lay down, the warrior poet taking his final rest where no eyes could see him falter. And thus he passed, not in battle with axe in hand, but with the same unyielding defiance that had marked every step of his life. Blind, old, and frail, he still denied his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him broken. In his last act, Egil proved that the Viking way of death was not always fire and sword. It could be a silence, a withdrawal, a choice to master one's fate until the final breath. The sagas remember him not only for his ferocity in war, nor for the poetry that dripped from his lips like blood from a wound, but for this ending, the treasure hidden, the body vanished, the mystery sealed. Egil Skallagrimsson did not yield to death as a prisoner. He walked into it as a master, leaving behind not just words and battles, but a legend carved in defiance. Even in blindness, even in age, he showed that a Viking's final act was never surrender. On the banks of the great Volga River in the year 922, an Arab traveller named Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed a sight that would haunt the world's memory of the Northmen. He had come as an envoy, a man of learning and faith, and found himself standing among a people whose customs seemed as alien as the frozen winds that carried them. There, before his eyes, unfolded the most infamous Viking funeral ever recorded, a ritual not of mourning, but of fire, flesh, and sacrifice. A chieftain had died, a man of stature among his people, and for him a ship was drawn onto the shore. Upon it lay his body, dressed in fine garments, surrounded by weapons, shields, and food for the journey ahead. But a Viking lord could not travel into the afterlife alone. Companions must follow to serve him beyond the grave. Among the slaves, one girl stepped forward, declaring, "I shall join my master." From that moment, she was set apart, her fate sealed not by chains, but by choice, or perhaps by the crushing weight of expectation. The days that followed were a grim festival. She was given wine, food, and strange rites to prepare her. Men came to her in turn, each claiming her body as part of the ritual, a final act meant to bind her to the path of the dead. Ibn Fadlan wrote of it with horror, yet the Vikings celebrated, drums beating, voices raised as though death were a wedding feast. On the appointed day, she was led to the ship, where her master's body lay waiting. She lifted a cup of strong drink, sang aloud, and seemed almost joyful, as if the promise of another life steadied her steps. Then came the end. 2 men seized her, while an old woman known as the Angel of Death took a short blade. She stabbed and strangled the girl at once, the life forced from her even as her cries were drowned in the clamour of the crowd. Her body was placed beside the dead chieftain, laid in embrace as though they were bound as man and wife. The ship was then set aflame, fire devouring wood, flesh, and treasure alike. Smoke rose to the sky, carrying with it the spirit of the fallen lord and the girl who had followed him. To Ibn Fadlan, it was barbarity beyond words, a spectacle of savagery he struggled to describe. To the Vikings, it was honour, the highest passage a chieftain could be granted, the assurance that in the next world he would not walk alone. This was their way, to turn death into theatre, sacrifice into memory, and fire into a bridge between worlds. And so the tale endures, one of the most shocking Viking deaths that was real, recorded not in sagas, but by the eyes of an outsider who could scarcely believe what he saw. The sagas tell us that not all Viking kings fell by the sword. Some met their end in fire, devoured not by steel, but by the flames that consumed their halls. Among the Yngling line, the oldest dynasty of the north, death by burning became both curse and custom, a ritual punishment whispered of with dread. To be trapped within one's own hall, the roof timbers cracking, the smoke choking, the fire raging hotter than any forge that was the fate of kings whose lives had stirred hatred too great for steel alone to quench. In the saga of the Ynglings, the chronicler speaks of Domalde, a king whose reign was marked by famine and despair. The harvest failed, the people starved, and the gods seemed deaf to every sacrifice. At last, the chieftains gathered and cast their eyes upon their king. It was decided that his life must pay for the land's hunger. They led him into the hall, their voices chanting as though in prayer, and when the doors were barred, the torches were set. Fire leapt along the beams, smoke rolled like storm clouds within, and Dumalde's cries rose with it, mingling with the roar of the blaze. His body fed the flames, and when the ashes cooled, the famine lifted. Thus the people believed their king's death had purchased the favour of the gods. Other Yngling rulers suffered the same fiery fate, not always for famine, but for feuds and vengeance. The saga tells of King Arn the Old, who lived too long and clung too fiercely to power. His own kin, weary of his grasp, chose fire as their weapon. They barred him in his hall, the place meant to guard his rule, and turned it into his pyre. The flames devoured both king and kingdom, for in that age a hall was more than wood and stone, it was the very heart of power. To burn it was to erase a ruler's memory in smoke, leaving only whispers. For the Vikings, fire was more than destruction, it was passage. Ships burned upon the shore to send chieftains to the afterlife, warriors cremated with their arms to rise in Valhalla's hall. But when fire was turned against the living, it became terror made flesh. A hall burning was no mere killing. It was a judgment, a declaration that the king's name would be remembered not in glory but in ash. Such was the fate of the Yngling kings who perished in flame. Their deaths were not battles sung by skalds, but lessons carved into the saga of their line. Fire became the weapon that could kill even a ruler, consuming flesh, timber, and legacy alike. Among the Norse, no death was meaningless. Even the most terrible left behind memory, and in the Yngling's pyres we see how the North shaped kings into sacrifices, and fire into story. The saga of the Greenlanders tells of a moment unlike any other, when fear itself took the shape of a woman. Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red and sister to Leif the Lucky, had crossed the sea to Vinland, that far and wild land beyond Greenland, where forests stretched vast, and the air was rich with promise. But in that strange country, danger walked close. One night, the Norse camp was struck by native warriors, their cries piercing the dark as spears and arrows rained upon the settlers. Men fell, panic spread, and those who still stood wavered, outnumbered, and unready for the storm. It was then that Freydis rose. 7 months with child, she refused to flee when the men turned to run. Instead, she seized a fallen warrior's sword, the weight of it steady in her hands, though death loomed all around. Her companions cried out that the fight was lost, but Freydis' voice cut sharper than any blade. She hurled her defiance into the night, a roar that silenced even the clamour of battle. As the attackers pressed closer, Freydis bared her breast and struck it with the flat of her sword, a gesture so fierce, so wild, that it froze the enemy where they stood. In that moment, she was no longer merely a woman nor a settler defending her kin. She became a vision of death itself, terrible and unyielding, as if the spirit of the Valkyries had descended into her body. The warriors, who had moments before sent hardened men into flight, faltered. Fear rippled through their ranks. One by one they withdrew, retreating into the shadows of the forest, unwilling to face the wrath she embodied. The Norsemen who had fled returned to find Freydis standing alone, sword in hand, her body trembling with fury but unbroken. Around her lay the silence of victory, not won by steel or numbers, but by the sheer force of will that turned the tide. Her act was remembered not because she slew a dozen foes, but because she had made them believe she could. For the Vikings, such a death-defying stand was worth more than any hoard of treasure. It was proof that courage itself was a weapon, more potent than axe or spear. Freydis had shown that terror could be cast back upon the enemy, that fear was a blade one could wield if only one had the heart to raise it. The sagas tell this tale not as a fancy, but as memory. and, whether every detail is true or not, its truth lies in what it reveals of the Norse spirit. That, even in the face of hopeless odds, even when abandoned and encircled, defiance could still scatter foes. Freydis of Vinland stood unflinching, and in her bare-breasted fury carved her place among the most shocking Viking deaths and defiant acts that were ever told. The sagas speak of Hervor, a woman whose courage was so fierce that even the dead could not deny her. She was no meek daughter content with the weaving hall or the hearth. Blood of warriors ran in her veins, and she chose the life of a shield maiden, fearless where others trembled. But it was not on the battlefield that she first proved her mettle. It was in the shadowed silence of a burial mound, where the restless dead lay with their cursed treasures. Her father, Angantyr, had perished with his brothers, and with him was buried Tyrfing, the sword forged in dark magic. The blade was said to bring victory to its wielder, but also doom, for it carried with it a curse, that it must drink blood whenever it was drawn, and that it would one day destroy those who bore it. Few dared even to whisper its name, but Hervor, armed with nothing but her will, strode alone into the night, lantern light flickering against the mound's stones. She called upon the spirits of her kin, demanding that they rise and yield her the weapon of her bloodline. From the earth their voices rose, hollow and dread, warning her away. Flames flickered across the ground, ghost fire searing the dark as the dead spoke. Foolish child, you call upon shadows, Tyrfing is doom, and it shall be your ruin. But Hervor did not falter. She called again, her voice louder than the storm winds, commanding her father to give her the sword that was her right. At last the mound cracked open, and Angantyr's hand thrust forth the cursed blade, gleaming with a cold light, as if hungering for blood even in the stillness of death. Hervor grasped it, and though the spirits wailed, she stood unflinching, the sword now hers. With Tyrfing at her side, she lived as a warrior, raiding and battling as fearlessly as any man. Her name spread across the north, and those who faced her in combat spoke of a woman aflame with fury, wielding a sword that seemed to thirst of its own will. Yet fate, as the mound had foretold, was not kind. In her later years, she stood with her people against raiders, old yet unyielding, her cursed blade still in hand. The battle was fierce, and the shield wall broke around her, but Hervor did not retreat. Surrounded, she fought until the end, Tyrfing rising and falling, cutting men down even as her strength ebbed. When at last her body fell, the sword lay clutched tight in her grip, crimson to the hilt. Thus passed Hervor, who had dared to walk among the dead, and seize from them what none other dared touch. Her life was proof that terror could be defied, that even curses could be wielded if the hand was strong enough. She died as she had lived defiant, sword in hand, a saga heroine who carved her fate against gods, men, and the restless dead alike. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, in the year 1066, was the twilight of the Viking Age, yet it gave birth to one of its most unforgettable deaths. King Harald Hardrada had brought his great host into England, but fate turned against him when King Harold Godwinson struck swift and hard. The Vikings, caught unarmoured in the heat of day, fell back toward their ships, pressed by English steel. Yet on the narrow wooden bridge that spanned the river Derwent, one man chose to stand. A lone berserker, towering and fierce, barred the way, his great axe gripped in both hands. As the English host thundered forward, the berserker roared, his voice carrying across the clash of men. They charged, and he struck. The axe fell like the judgment of the gods, shattering shields, splitting helmets, cleaving men, as though they were reeds. Warrior after warrior rushed him, but the bridge was narrow, and only a few could face him at once. The timbers shook with the fury of battle, yet the berserker did not yield. Bodies piled at his feet, blood running down into the river's current. The English pressed harder, stung by the defiance of one man holding an army at bay. They came with spears, with arrows, with curses shouted to unnerve him, but still he fought. each stroke of his axe sending another foe to the ground. His companions, rallying behind him, watched in awe as he turned the bridge into a slaughterhouse. For a time, he was a wall of iron and rage, a single Viking halting the flood of a kingdom's army. But even the greatest strength cannot defy numbers forever. The English, weary of watching their best men fall, sought another way. A soldier crept beneath the bridge, shielded by the planks, moving unseen while the berserker's fury held every eye above. Through a gap in the timbers, the hidden man thrust his spear upward, piercing the Viking from below. The iron bit into him, and blood poured, but even then he did not fall at once. With a final roar, he hewed one last enemy down before his knees buckled and the axe slipped from his hands. He collapsed among the bodies he had slain. His stand ended not by courage, but by cunning. The bridge was taken, and with it the last hope of Hardrada's army. Yet the memory of that lone warrior outlived the battle. The English themselves, though victors, marvelled at his valour, recording his defiance with reluctant awe. In death, he became more than a nameless fighter. He was the spirit of the North, made flesh unyielding, savage, fearless, until the very last. So ended the berserker at Stamford Bridge, not with surrender, but with an axe in hand and enemies piled before him. His death was a saga in itself, a final blaze of Viking fury that marked the closing of an age. The sun blazed hot over Stamford Bridge, and the ground shook beneath the clash of two kingdoms. Harold Sigurdsson, called Hardrada the Hard Ruler, stood at the heart of it, towering above his men, his great two-handed axe hewing through the shield wall like fire through dry wood. He had crossed the sea with 300 ships, the last great Viking king seeking to claim the throne of England, and now the fate of his host burned with him in the fray. The English pressed hard, their shields locked, their spears thrusting, but wherever Harold strode, men fell. His voice rose above the din, a thunderous cry that drove courage into the hearts of his warriors. For a time, it seemed no force could stand against him. The axe swung in wide arcs, its edge biting through mail and bone alike, and the field rang with his fury. He was 60 years old, yet fought with the fire of a man in his prime, the living echo of an age already fading. But destiny waits for no king. As the battle raged, an arrow found its mark. It pierced his throat, slipping past the armour that had guarded him in 100 fights. The blow staggered him, blood welling, his voice choked by the cruel shaft. Around him, his men cried out, but Harold did not fall at once. He clutched the wound, crimson staining his beard, and straightened to face his enemies once more. Even with death upon him, he stood proud, unwilling to give them the sight of his weakness. It is said that in that final moment he shaped words into verse, as was the way of kings and skalds alike. His voice, though broken, carried still. We do not creep in battle under shields to die. The noble-hearted Valkyrie waits to welcome me. Whether the words were truly spoken, or whether they were woven later into saga, matters little. What endures is the image of the last great Viking king, bleeding yet unbent, turning his death into poetry. Then his knees gave way, and the axe slipped from his hands. Around him the shield wall broke, his men falling one by one, the tide of England surging forward. The day belonged to Harold Godwinson, but the memory belonged to Harold Hardrada. With that arrow in his throat, with verse on his lips, he sealed the Viking age in fire and song. Thus ended the last of the great sea kings, not in bed nor in flight, but on the field, weapon in hand, his death a legend as fierce as his life. Harold Hardrada's fall at Stamford Bridge was more than the loss of a king. It was the passing of an era, the final blaze of a people who had turned even death into defiance. The field of Stiklestad, in the year 1030, was drenched in storm cloud and omen, a place where kingship, faith, and steel would be decided in blood. Olaf Haraldsson, once king of Norway, had returned from exile with his followers to reclaim the throne. His rule had been harsh, his Christian zeal unforgiving, and many of his own people now rose against him. Farmers, nobles, and chieftains joined together, wielding axe and spear, not for foreign invaders, but to strike down their own king. Yet Olaf marched into their ranks without fear, for he believed his fate lay in the hands of God and in the stroke of his own sword. The battle was savage. The shield walls ground against one another, splinters of ash wood flying, blades flashing like lightning under dark skies. Olaf fought at the heart of the melee, his sword flashing, his presence towering among his dwindling host. Blow after blow fell upon him, but still he pressed forward, driving into the crush where the enemy was thickest. He was no saint then, but a warrior king of the old kind, refusing retreat, his faith and fury welded together. At last, fate struck. First came a spear thrust to his thigh, a deep wound that staggered him but could not bring him down. Then an axe cleaved into his neck, blood flowing like a river onto the trampled earth. Still Olaf did not fall. A final stroke came from a sword, piercing his belly through, and it was then he knew the end was near. But even as his body failed, he cast aside his blade, lifted his hands to the heavens, and spoke with his last breath, "God, help me." He fell upon the field, and with his death the battle was lost. His followers were cut down or fled, and his enemies believed their cause triumphant. Yet death did not silence Olaf. In the years that followed, tales spread of miracles worked at his grave, of the soil that healed, of the king whose body did not decay. Within a short time, the once feared ruler became street. Olaf, Norway's eternal king, a martyr whose blood sealed the Christian faith in his land. But to those who watched him at Stiklestad, his death was more than holy martyrdom. It was the ending of a warrior in the Viking fashion, weapon in hand, wounds taken without surrender, pressing forward even when fate itself struck him down. His canonization gave him a saint's crown, yet his manner of dying was thoroughly Norse, echoing the same defiance sung in the sagas. Olaf Haraldsson fell both as a Christian and as a Viking, uniting in his death two worlds that had long been at war. And so his martyrdom became legend, a tale where cross and sword met upon the same blood-soaked earth, and a king found eternity in both faith and defiance. The Jomsvikings were no ordinary band of raiders. They were a brotherhood of steel, bound by oath and discipline, men who lived and died by the sword with a loyalty that was as feared as their fury. When they were at last defeated in battle around the year 986, captured by Earl Hakon of Norway, their fate was sealed. No ransom was offered, no quarter given. They were to be put to death, one, by the axe. Yet what should have been a grim spectacle of submission became instead one of the most shocking Viking deaths ever told, for the Jomsvikings turned their executions into a contest of courage. They were led forth, bound, before the gathered crowd. The axe was raised, the block set, and the first warrior knelt. But instead of trembling, he laughed, declaring he cared not for death so long as his brothers avenged him. Another, as his turn came, asked the executioner to strike from the front, so he might look death squarely in the face. A third insisted that his head be held high, lest it fall into the mud and dishonour him. Each man sought not to escape death, but to master it, to leave behind words and deeds that would outlive his body. One warrior, with a knife still in hand, proposed a test. "When my head is struck from me, if I yet have thought, I will point this blade forward. If not, it will fall." The blow came, his body quivered, and the knife fell from his grip. The crowd gasped, unsure if it was muscle or will, but the effect was chilling. Another, just before the axe fell, quipped that he had often wondered what a man felt when his head was parted from his body. Soon he would find out, and he would not tell. The air was thick with awe and unease, for what kind of men treated their own death as sport? The saga tells that Earl Hakon himself was moved. One after another, the Jomsvikings went to their fate without flinching, their jokes sharper than steel, their laughter louder than the executioner's blade. They robbed their enemies of triumph, for every strike of the axe was met not with screams, but with defiance. At last, so impressed was the Earl by their composure, that he spared the lives of the remaining warriors, unwilling to extinguish such courage. Their deaths and their survival entered legend. The Jomsvikings showed that fearlessness itself was a weapon, one that no foe could strip from them. In that yard of blood and iron, the execution meant to shame them became their greatest victory. Their saga was not written in the battles they won, but in the way they died, unyielding, mocking, immortal in the face of the axe. On a wind-scoured hill in Dorset, England, a grim secret lay buried for 1,000 years. When the earth was opened at Ridgeway Hill, archaeologists uncovered a pit filled with the remains of 54 Viking men. Their skulls lay separate from their bodies, heaped like trophies, while the headless corpses were cast aside in careless disorder. Time had sealed the silence, but the bones spoke with their own terrible eloquence. This was no battlefield grave, it was an execution ground. Each man had been beheaded, the strokes of the blades still etched into their bones. Some bore the marks of repeated blows, as if the headsman's hand had faltered or the victims had struggled. Yet the most striking revelation was not how they died, but how they faced it. There were no signs of shackles, no evidence of bonds upon their wrists or ankles. These warriors had not been dragged unwilling to the block. They had knelt willingly, unrestrained, to meet their end. It is not hard to imagine the scene. A captured warband, proud sons of the North, perhaps brought to shore after a failed raid. The Anglo-Saxon executioners gathered them on the hill, seeking to make an example that would echo across the land. One by one, the Vikings were called forward. Instead of pleading, instead of struggling, they met the blade as the Jomsvikings had done before them with iron composure. Some may have laughed. Others may have uttered verses, their voices carrying on the wind until cut short by steel. Each man claimed his death as his own, denying the enemy the triumph of fear. To the Anglo-Saxons who stood watching, it must have been unnerving. These men had come to England to raid, to burn, to take what was not theirs. Yet even defeated, even kneeling at the edge of death, they did not break. Their courage outlived their bodies. And when their severed heads were piled in a heap, it was not victory alone that lay there, but also a reminder of the foe they faced, men who conquered death as fiercely as they conquered kingdoms. The Ridgeway Hill massacre remains one of the starkest glimpses into the Viking mind. For the sagas tell of fearlessness, of men who laughed at the gallows and sang at the stake, but here the bones confirm it. This was not saga, nor poetry, nor legend, it was flesh and blood, preserved in the earth until uncovered by chance. 54 men died that day, their bodies discarded, their skulls thrown in a heap. Yet far from being silenced, their deaths still speak across the centuries. They remind us that for the Vikings, even execution could become defiance. Ridgeway Hill was meant to be their end. Instead, it became their story, a story of warriors who met the axe without bonds, without fear, and with the unyielding composure that made them so dangerous in life and unforgettable in death. In the quiet fields of Repton, England, the earth still bears the scars of the great heathen army. It was here, in the winter of 873, that the vast host of Ragnar's sons made their camp, a force so terrible that kings fled before them. Centuries later, when the ground was opened, a discovery emerged that spoke not only of conquest, but of death, made ritual. A shallow pit held the bones of nearly 300 men, heaped together in a mass grave. At its heart lay one body set apart, laid to rest with honour, surrounded by the discarded dead. This was no simple burial, it was a message carved into soil and bone. The central figure was a warrior of renown. His body had been placed carefully, weapons and treasures at his side, the marks of a leader among men. Yet beneath him, crumpled and broken, lay another man, cast carelessly into the grave, his head crushed by a brutal blow. To scholars, the meaning is chillingly clear. This second man was a sacrifice, slain to accompany the honoured warrior into death, his own life taken to serve another's journey. Around them, the pit was filled with men who had suffered violent ends, sword cuts to bone, spear wounds through ribs, skulls split by heavy blows. These were not natural deaths. This was the price of war, gathered together in one great offering. The air of that winter long ago must have been thick with both triumph and dread. For the Vikings, death was never only loss, it was passage, transformation, and sometimes necessity. To bury a leader with honour was to ensure his strength carried into the next world. To add a sacrifice beneath him was to bind his soul with service even beyond the grave. And to heap the dead of his following beside him was to remind both friend and foe that the great army lived by a code as fierce in death as in life. The chronicles of the monks, who trembled as the Norse camped at their gates, tell of horror and devastation, but the grave itself tells another tale. To the Vikings, this was not brutality for its own sake. It was ritual, the mingling of honour and cruelty, of reverence and violence, until the two could not be told apart. The warrior at the centre was remembered, his death marked with care. The sacrifice beneath him was erased, his body discarded like kindling, and yet both, in their own way, became part of the same story. The Repton death pit stands as one of the most haunting legacies of the Viking Age. It shows that to the Northmen, war and faith were bound by blood, and death itself was a canvas upon which power could be written. In that cold earth, victory, sacrifice, and fear were all woven together, a testament to how the Vikings turned even the grave into a weapon of memory. At Repton, where the earth still whispers of the great heathen army, one grave stands apart from all the rest. Unlike the mass pit filled with tangled bones, this burial was deliberate, almost ceremonial. A single warrior lay stretched in the soil, his body arranged with care, weapons placed at his side, as though he would need them in the halls beyond. His wounds spoke of battle blades and spears had found him, yet he had been chosen for honour. But beneath him, crushed under his weight, was another man. This second body was cast in with no reverence, no grave goods, no order. His skull was shattered by a violent blow, his corpse thrown like refuse to serve as the foundation for another's eternal rest. To the eyes of those who unearthed it, the meaning was clear. This was no accident of burial, it was sacrifice. The second man had died not for his own glory, but to follow the first into death. His life extinguished, so the honoured warrior might pass more richly into the afterworld. For the Vikings, this mingling of reverence and cruelty was no contradiction. It was custom, rooted in a belief that the dead could carry servants as surely as the living. A leader in life must not walk alone in death. The image is stark, the clamour of the funeral rites, the torches flickering against the winter sky, the warrior's body cleansed and dressed in finery. Around him, comrades chanting, steel ringing against shields in tribute. And beside them, the doomed companion, forced to kneel, struck down with a single crushing blow, his blood seeping into the soil that would soon claim him. Then the grave was filled, the honoured man laid atop the discarded, as if to remind all who looked that power extends even beyond death. The chronicles written by monks speak of the Vikings as butchers, revelling in slaughter. Yet here, the grave reveals something deeper and more unsettling. This was not chaos. It was ritual, measured, and purposeful. To the Norse mind, sacrifice was a bridge between worlds, binding the living and the dead, shaping the fate of both. The warrior buried with honour was not simply mourned, he was equipped, strengthened, and accompanied, even if that meant another man's life was taken to serve. The double grave at Repton remains one of the clearest signs that the old customs of the North were carried deep into the heart of England. It shows us how the Vikings wove meaning into violence, how they transformed death into something both sacred and terrible. One man lay as a hero, another as an offering, and together they formed a story written not in words, but in soil, steel, and blood. The death of Hrolf Kraki, the famed king of Denmark, was no quiet passing. His saga tells of a hall, once bright with feasting and song, turned into a furnace of death. Betrayal lit the flames. His rival, Skuld, raised rebellion and sought to erase his name with fire. So it was that Hrolf and his chosen champions, men of renown, found themselves trapped within their own hall, the timbers groaning as fire raced along the roof beams, arrows raining through the smoke. To many, such a death would have been despair. To Hrolf Elef's band, it was a chance to show the world how warriors meet their end. The doors were barred, the flames closed in, and yet no man whimpered, no voice cried out in fear. Instead, the champions laughed, jesting with one another as the arrows pierced their flesh and the fire licked at their cloaks. One drew an arrow from his chest, looked upon its feathers, and quipped that the Swedish king fed his geese well. Another mocked the heat, saying that at least the cold of winter would trouble them no longer. Amidst the roar of fire, they raised their voices in gallows humour, turning agony into jest and transforming slaughter into spectacle. Hrolf himself stood among them, calm as the flames climbed higher, his presence steadying those around him. He urged them not to yield, not to give their enemies the pleasure of seeing fear in their eyes. The hall became a shield wall of fire, each man standing shoulder to shoulder, singing and jesting as though the feast had not ended. Outside, the enemy listened in wonder, hearing not cries of pain but laughter carried on the smoke. The blaze that was meant to humiliate Hrolf's band instead became their pyre of glory. At last, the roof gave way, and the champions were consumed, but their defiance lived on in the telling. To the north, it was not the fire that triumphed, nor Skuld who claimed victory, but Hrolf and his men, who showed that even in defeat, they could master death itself. The sagas do not speak of them as broken, but as legends, their laughter rising higher than the flames. The hall burning of Hrolf Kraki and his champions endures as one of the most striking deaths in Viking lore. It was not the sword that ended them, but betrayal and fire. Yet they robbed their foes of triumph by turning horror into performance. In those final moments, as the hall collapsed in embers and smoke, they claimed what mattered most to a Viking, the manner of dying. For though their bodies turned to ash, their names were carried in story, their courage etched into memory, their laughter echoing long after the fire had died. The saga of Gisli Sursen tells of a man hounded by fate, an outlaw marked not by cowardice, but by the weight of vengeance and honour. For 13 winters he lived as a hunted beast, wandering the wild places of Iceland, every hand against him, every farmstead whispering his name as though he were already a ghost. Yet he endured, carrying his sword as both burden and companion, waiting for the day when fate would come to claim him. That day arrived at last, when 14 men came together to end the outlaw's long defiance. They found him at his refuge, and Gisli did not flee. He stood alone, sword in hand, a man who knew his doom had come, but welcomed it with fire in his eyes. The clash was terrible. 14 against 1, yet the outlaw's blade sang with fury. He cut through them like a storm through branches, the steel rising and falling, leaving broken men at his feet. One fell with a cry, another with silence, and still Gisli pressed on, wounds opening across his body, but his strength unspent. By the time the tide turned, 8 of his foes lay dead upon the ground, slain by a man already doomed. But numbers at last overcame valour. His body weakened, blood pouring from his wounds, and his breath came ragged as the circle closed. Yet Gisli would not grant his killers the sight of him broken. Leaning upon his sword, he lifted his voice one final time, not in curses, not in pleas, but in verse. For he was a skald as well as a warrior, and poetry was the weapon of his spirit. His last words rose in the rhythm of saga, speaking of courage, of loyalty to his kin, of the fleeting nature of life and the certainty of death. Each word was a blow struck against fear itself, his voice defying silence even as blood choked his lips. When the final stroke came, it did not erase him, for his enemies slew his body, but not his story. The image of Gisli, standing alone against 14, sword crimson in his hand, voice lifted in poetry as he fell, was carried into memory, into saga, into the marrow of the North. His death became more than defeat. It was a performance of defiance, a reminder that a true warrior decides not only how he lives, but how he dies. Thus perished Gisli Surson, outlaw and poet, whose last stand was written not only in steel and blood, but in verse. His killers thought to end him with their axes, yet they could not silence the poetry of his death. In life, he was hunted. In death, he became legend. In the far-flung isles of Orkney, where the sea gnaws endlessly at black cliffs and the wind carries the voices of old gods, there lived a Viking named Thorbjorn. He was no common raider, but a man of will and ferocity, whose name had carried across the waves on the lips of both friend and foe. Yet even the strongest man may fall to fate, and Thorbjorn at last was captured by Earl Rognvald after a bitter raid. His doom was certain. Death waited for him in the yard, the axe already sharpened. But Thorbjorn was not content to die as any prisoner would. If his life must end, it would end on his terms. Brought before the crowd, he stood tall though his wrists were bound. The Earl pronounced his fate beheading, swift and final. A murmur went through the gathered throng, for all wished to see how this warrior, who had so long defied his enemies, would face the final moment. Thorbjorn's answer was not silence, but a challenge. He demanded a stick, a simple piece of wood, which he placed firmly between his teeth. "When the axe falls," he declared, "if I bite through this stick, then you will know that fear took me. If it remains whole, then you shall see I felt nothing." His words carried across the crowd, and even the executioner faltered for a breath, unsettled by the calmness in his tone. Thorbjorn knelt at the block, the stick held fast between his teeth, his eyes fixed ahead with the steady fire of a man who would not yield even to death. The axe was raised high, gleaming in the grey light, and with a single stroke it came down. His body stiffened, the crowd hushed, and the stick remained unbroken. Gasps rippled through those who watched. The head rolled from the body, but the jaw had not flinched, the wood still clenched firm between his teeth. Even severed from breath, Thorbjorn's will had prevailed. He had mocked death, mocked pain, and proved himself unafraid to the last instant. His enemies had taken his life, but they had not taken his spirit. The tale of Thorbjorn's end spread quickly across the isles, and the mainland beyond. His death was no longer the triumph of the earl who condemned him, but the triumph of the man who made even his execution a stage for defiance. To the Norse mind, such an end was worth more than life prolonged, for it showed that courage can outlive flesh. Thus Thorbjorn passed into saga, remembered not as a captive brought low, but as a warrior who mastered his own death. The stick clenched between his teeth became a symbol of his fearlessness, proof that a Viking could rob his enemies of victory even as the axe struck. In the end, his death was not defeat, but legend. In the green hills of Vestfold, Norway, the mound of Oseberg held a secret for more than 1,000 years. When it was opened, what lay within stunned even the scholars who had studied the sagas. A great ship, its prow carved like a serpent, had been drawn ashore and buried beneath the earth. Within its hull rested 2 women, one of high birth and one of lower station, their bodies surrounded by treasures fit for kings. Tapestries, carved sledges, woven blankets, and the bones of sacrificed animals filled the vessel, as though to carry their mistress in splendour to the halls beyond. Yet among the rich offerings, one detail whispered of darker rites. The second woman, likely a slave or servant, had not been laid to rest with honour. She had been sacrificed, buried alive to accompany her mistress into death. The queen or noblewoman was aged, her body wrapped in fine cloth, her authority carried into the grave by the wealth piled around her. But the younger woman told a harsher tale. Her remains bore signs of violence, her life taken not by illness nor age, but by human hands. The positioning of her body, the absence of goods at her side, all pointed to her fate. She had not chosen her place upon that ship, she had been offered. Imagine the funeral as it unfolded more than a millennium ago. The ship hauled to its resting mound, the ground trembling with the chanting of mourners. Animals led forth and slain, their blood soaking the soil, the air heavy with incense and smoke. The noblewoman, prepared with care, lowered into the ship, her passage furnished with the beauty and power of her life. Then the servant, taken by the arms of men, pushed forward into the vessel. Perhaps she struggled, perhaps she went quietly, believing it her duty. The sagas tell of such women, who volunteered to join their masters, but the silence of her bones suggests something else, a ritual not of choice, but of command. When the mound was sealed, when the timbers were covered in earth, and the cries of the living fell silent, she lay trapped in the darkness, a life extinguished to serve another. To the Vikings, this was no cruelty, but necessity. Their dead of high rank were not to walk alone. Just as goods and beasts were given, so too were servants, bound to follow in both life and death. The Oseberg burial remains one of the richest ever found, a treasure trove that speaks of artistry, power, and wealth. Yet beneath its beauty lies the shadow of sacrifice, a reminder that the splendor of the Viking elite was often built upon the suffering of others. In the quiet soil of Oseberg, the two women remain, one remembered as mistress, the other as offering. Together, they embody the Viking truth that death was not only journey and passage, but also dominion, a claim over life that extended even beyond the grave. In the soil of Ireland, where monasteries once burned beneath the sails of dragon-prowed ships, the bones of Vikings whisper of a strange and terrible fate. Excavations have uncovered mass graves where warriors lay without their heads, their skulls severed clean by executioners' blades. Yet these were not the careless burials of criminals or slaves. These men were sent to the earth with their weapons, swords, and spears placed beside their broken bodies, as if to honor them even in death. It was as though their enemies, having struck them down, could not deny the defiance that still clung to them. The sight of such a grave tells its own story. The bodies, lined together in silence, testify not to a battle lost upon the field, but to capture and execution. They had been taken alive, restrained long enough for the axe to fall. Yet something in the burial speaks of respect, or perhaps unease. To place weapons with the headless is to admit that even in death these men were dangerous, that their spirits would not be bound by the loss of their bodies. Better to arm them, as if to appease them, than to leave them restless beneath the soil. Picture the moment before their deaths. A line of Norse warriors kneeling upon foreign earth, the crowd gathered, priests chanting, the executioner's blade raised high. The Irish lords who ordered it sought to make a spectacle, to show that the terror of the North could be broken. Yet, if the sagas teach anything, it is that such men did not face death with silence. Perhaps they laughed, as their brothers had done on the gallows in Francia. Perhaps they boasted of the feasting hall of Odin, where the mead flowed, and the slain of every age welcomed them. What seems certain is that they did not yield fear, for fear was the only true defeat. When the axe fell, it silenced flesh, but not memory. Those who watched would not soon forget the way these strangers met death, their courage unshaken, their spirit unbowed. And when the time came to bury them, even their foes could not treat them as nameless dead. They were given the trappings of warriors, their swords laid close, their spears pressed into the earth beside them. The message was clear. These were enemies, yes, but enemies worthy of remembrance. The headless graves of Ireland stand as a grim monument to the Viking way of death. To be executed was no shame, so long as one met the end without trembling. In life they had raided and burned. In death they turned execution into defiance. Their skulls may be gone, their bodies broken, but the courage carved into their last moments remains. The Irish buried them with weapons, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. Even in silence, even in soil, the Vikings were still warriors. The twilight of the Viking Age did not come with a single battle or a single king's fall, but with the slow turning of years, when Christ's cross began to rise where Thor's hammer once hung, and kings forged kingdoms where war bands had once roamed. Yet even as the old ways faded, the manner of Viking death remained unchanged. Across the north, men and women still faced their ends, as their forefathers had, with laughter, with defiance, with words shaped into song. If their gods shifted, if their banners bore the sign of the White Christ instead of Odin's ravens, still the spirit of fearlessness endured. The sagas tell of warriors who, even in this twilight, met death with the same fire as Ragnar in the snake pit, or Thormod with an arrow through his heart. A chieftain cut down in his hall might quip of the meal awaiting him beyond. A skald, bleeding on the ground, would spend his final breath crafting verse rather than groaning in pain. Even kings who bent the knee to Christ died in the old fashion, sword in hand, refusing retreat. Olaf Haraldsson at Stiklestad, Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, both passed into legend not for the crowns they sought, but for the manner of their dying. By the 11th century, the Viking longships no longer carried terror to distant shores as they once had. Yet the memory of those who had faced death unflinching lingered like smoke on the wind. Their enemies remembered it too. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers wrote with awe of the heathens who feared not death, and monks in Francia recalled raiders who laughed as the noose tightened around their throats. To them, it was incomprehensible, a kind of sorcery. To the Norse, it was the way of things. Death was no shame, if it was met without fear. Even as the last great sea kings fell, the old mindset carved itself into story. A single berserker on a bridge, holding off an army until pierced from below. Outlaws, who fought impossible odds, dying with verses on their lips. Warriors executed in foreign lands, kneeling willingly before the axe. These were not merely deaths. They were performances, acts meant to echo across the years. And echo they did. 1,000 winters have passed since the last Viking ships prowled the coasts of Europe, yet their deaths are still told. Not because of the lands they conquered, nor the treasures they seized, but because of how they met their end. Fear was the one enemy they never allowed to master them. Thus the Viking Age closed, not with silence, but with defiance. Even in its fading, the North preserved the truth that had made its people so dangerous, so unforgettable. That death, faced without trembling, becomes not defeat but legend. And so the last Viking deaths carried the same fire as the first, fearless to the end, their courage still burning in the stories we tell.